Hello and welcome back. Alright, so in this second part of the introductory tutorial series, we're going to go over how to navigate in 3D space, how to add objects to our scene, what each different section of the program Blender itself is and what it does, and then we're also going to learn how to render a scene. Okay, so after we've opened up Blender, you will see that we've got a camera, a cube, and a lamp. Okay, and all of these objects are in our viewport, which is where we work in 3D space. Okay, now to the left of the viewport, we have kind of like a toolbar over here. This just gives you a bunch of different options. Okay, anywhere from translations to rotate, scale, and on down the list. Alright, and then over here on the right hand side, in the top right, you'll notice that this list right here has different stuff in our scene, and this is what's called an outliner. Okay, and within the outliner, it'll automatically update so you know everything that's going on in your scene, and you can actually select various objects. That way you can find them easier if you're in a really complex scene that you're working on or whatnot. Other than that, it just helps you maintain what's going on. Okay, then the bottom right is the properties panel. Okay, and your properties panel might look a little different than mine. That's because I'm using the Cycles render engine, where by default it has the Blender render engine properties over here. Okay, which all of this we're going to get into as we go throughout the series. But for now, at this point, let's go ahead and learn how to actually navigate in 3D space and play with our objects. Okay, so if you notice, I just pulled out this little screen right over here that shows you the mouse. Alright, but it also shows you whatever it is that I'm typing on the keyboard as well. Okay, and all that this is going to do is make it a little easier for you guys to actually learn keyboard shortcuts for Blender. Okay, and so the first thing that we're going to learn is how to kind of look around. And if you notice on the mouse, you'll see that the middle mouse button is selected. And all I'm doing is clicking and holding while dragging my mouse, and that's what allows me to rotate in 3D space. Okay. Now if I want to, say, pan around my view, all you have to do is hold the Shift button down on your keyboard and then do the same thing and click and drag your middle mouse button, and you can pan around your view. Alright, now zooming in and out is again with the scroll wheel, except you don't click, you just simply scroll forward or backwards to zoom in and out. Alright, now the next thing that we're going to go over is how to actually manipulate our objects on a very basic level of moving them around, adding objects to our scene, and then we're going to learn how to render. Okay, so first, over here on the left with this toolbar, how you have translate, rotate, and scale, you can click on them and then just move your mouse from there until you find something that you like. However, there's a much easier way, and that is using keyboard shortcuts, which in Blender, if you hover over a button and it has an available shortcut for you, in the little window that pops up with the description, you'll also see a shortcut given for that option as well. Which, for example, translate, the shortcut is G on the keyboard. And then for rotate, the shortcut is R, and scale, the shortcut is S. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and take our cube, and if we press G, while it's selected, which to select an object, any object, you just click the right mouse button. Okay. So let's say I want to move my cube up. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just tap G, and now I have the freedom to move it however I want. So if I want to go ahead and just drag it up, I can. However, it doesn't appear to be along the same exact point that it was when it first started. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to press G, and then we're going to press Z, and then it'll allow me to move it strictly on the Z axis. Okay, and you can do this with all objects. So whether you want to leave it on the z-axis, after you press G, you have the options of z, x for the x-axis, and y for the y-axis. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and grab it, and then move it up, and then left click and release, and now my cube is going to stay there. Okay. Now, to deselect objects, or to select all objects at once, it's going to be the A key. Now all I do is tap that, and now my cube is deselected, and if I tap it again, it selects everything in my scene. Okay. So, now that is simple navigation in 3D space. Now, if you want to be a little more precise, like for example, if you're working rather hard on something and you're fine-tuning an object, the best way to do that is on your keyboard. If you press 5 on the number pad, it will bring you into orthographic view instead of perspective view. Okay. And as you'll notice, it looks a little different. However, the entire purpose of it is, if you go back to perspective view really quick, and if you press the 1 on your number pad, you'll notice that it doesn't exactly look on a perfect, you can't see your scene on a perfect side facing, okay, and that's because it's perspective view. Perspective view is what allows you to see objects as if they were in real life, okay. Now in orthographic view, if I press 1 again, I get a perfect profile, okay, so now I can go in, manipulate however I wish, and then I'm good to go, okay. So now, once you're in orthographic view, again, if you press 1 on your number pad, it will bring it to the front orthographic view. And if you press 3, it'll bring you to the right orthographic view, and then 7 will give you a top view. Okay. And that is basic maneuvering and moving both objects and your view around in 3D space. So now what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to add objects to our scene, and we're going to learn how to render using both the internal Blender render engine and then the Cycles render engine, both of which come prepackaged with Blender. Okay. So what we're going to do is I'm going to deselect my cube by pressing A, and then I'm going to add a plane, so I actually have a floor for my scene, and you can do that using one of 2 ways. The first option is to come up here and press Add, and then you get this list. But the second option, which is much faster, is if you hold down the Shift button and then press A on your keyboard, you get that exact same list. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into a mesh and add plane. And you'll notice I have this little orange line here. That's because it's the same size as the cube. But I'm going to go ahead and use the scale function. Okay. And what scale is once you press S, you can now scale your object out. Or, if you want to be more precise and mathematical about it, you can press S, and then let's say I want to make my plane 10 times bigger. Well, after I've told my computer that I want to scale the plane, all I have to do is go to my number pad and type in 10, and now it's 10 times bigger. Okay, so we'll deselect that, but here's the problem. My cube is being cut in half by the plane. So what I'm going to do now is select my cube, press G and then Z, so I can move it along the Z-axis, and I'm going to bring it to where it's resting right on top. Okay, and if we look at it from the front view, you'll notice that it is sitting right on the X-axis. Okay. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I want to add something else to my scene. So I'm going to press Shift A again, go under Mesh, add a UV sphere, and even though we can't see it, it is right here. So I'm going to press G and then Y, so it moves only on the Y-axis. Bring it out, left click, G and Z again, and bring it up so I can see my whole object. Deselect it, and I'm going to add one more object. So Shift A again, Mesh, and Cone, and we're going to go GX to move on the X-axis, bring it out, and then GZ, and bring it up. Okay. Now, the first thing we're going to do at this point is learn how to render a scene using the internal Blender rendering engine. Okay. Now, you'll notice, aside from the fact that we have our 3 objects here, we also have this little dot over here, which is a lamp, which I'm going to go ahead and pull this down. And then here, we have a camera. Okay. And I know it doesn't look like a camera, but that is what a camera is in Blender. Alright. Now, in order to see what the camera sees, on your number pad, you press 0, and it will take you to your camera view. Okay. And all of our objects are already in the camera's viewport, so that's good. We don't have to move them around, and we don't have to move the camera around. So at this point, let's just go ahead and come over to our Properties panel and click on Render and see what we get. Okay, so that ain't bad. Now, in order to get out of this right here from viewing our rendered image, we're going to go ahead and press Escape. And now we're going to learn how to render using the Cycles render engine. And now Cycles is a newer rendering engine, and it was added to Blender later on. And I personally like it because it makes it easier to make objects look more realistic. You can have a lot of fun with it, but whichever engine you choose to use to render is entirely up to you. Okay, but in order to switch between the rendering engines, up here at the top where it says Blender Render, we're going to go ahead and left click on that and go down to where it says Cycles Render. Okay, and when you do that, if you didn't notice, your Properties panel changed slightly. Okay, and that's because Cycles utilizes a few different things that the internal render engine doesn't. So the other thing in the Properties panel is here under the Render tab where it says Device, by default your copy of Blender is going to say CPU. Okay, and you notice you have GPU and then CPU. Now the reason why by default I have my computer set up to use the GPU is because when it comes to rendering using Cycles, if you use the CPU, your processor, it can render much slower than the graphical processing unit can, and so it also puts a lot more stress on your computer if you're using the processor. But if you switch it over to GPU, provided that you have a second video card in your computer, it can render much faster, which granted saves you a lot of time, and it takes a lot of stress off of your computer's processor. Okay. So then another thing with Cycles is you can actually preview what everything looks like in your scene without rendering. Okay. And the way you do that is by down here at the bottom, you'll notice how it shows you this little white circle. If you click on that, you'll notice you have this option up here that says Rendered. Okay, now this option does not exist under the internal Blender render engine. It only works with Cycles. Okay, so if we click on this, you'll notice that we already have a preview of our scene. Okay, and the reason why it gets very pixelated and then fine-tunes itself is because it's actually working in real time. Alright, and again, I'm also using the GPU so it renders faster. Okay. Now, when it comes to previewing and also rendering in Cycles, under the rendering option here in the Properties menu, if you click on the Sampling tab if it's not already open, then under Samples on the right you'll have Render and then Preview, and both of which are set at 10. Okay, well for Preview that is perfectly fine because it's just giving us a quick idea of what we're looking at, so we'll leave that at 10. However, for Render, I don't want to be seeing all this graininess within my image, so I'm going to go ahead and bump this up to, say, 300. Okay. And so now, just like with the Blender internal render engine, all you have to do is click on Render, and it will render what our camera sees. Okay. And as you can see, in relation to the internal rendering engine, this one's taking much longer. and that is because of the way that cycles functions. Okay, and so as this is going, you'll also notice here in the shadow, where in our preview how it was grainy, now it's not, and that's because I bumped the sampling up to 300 instead of 10. Okay. And then the other thing is using lights or lamps in cycles, like what we are currently doing. You can, but I actually don't like doing it just because Cycles was built using an entirely different system, you could say, as far as lighting goes. So even though this looks all cute and whatnot, I'm actually going to show you how to render lighting using a more proper method in Blender. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and hit Escape, and then we're going to come down here and go back to Solid View. And now I'm going to right-click on my camera, press X, hit Delete, and now this is going to sound a little weird, but I'm actually going to add another plane to my scene. Okay, so Shift-A, Mesh, Plane. Next I'm going to bring it up, set it about right here, then I'm going to scale it out so it covers a wider area. Okay, now at the present time, if I go back to rendered, it doesn't look any brighter, and it's not going to. But that's because I haven't set the properties for this second plane yet. Okay, so how we do that is if we go back into our properties panel and we click on this red circle here, we can add materials to our objects. And so I'm going to add a new material. I'm going to bring up preview and surface, and by default all objects in your scene are going to have a material property of diffuse. But for the second plane up here, we don't want that because we want this plane to be acting as a light. So I'm going to go ahead and click on diffuse and actually set it to emission. Okay, and as you can see, it just got a lot brighter in our scene. So now the other thing is let's pretend for a second that what we're looking at is what our camera's seeing, you know, and we're seeing this huge white square over here, and it just looks ugly and it's destroying the feel of our scene. The way we can fix that is, let's see, is it over here? No, I believe it's going to be post processing, performance, GPU, film. Is it under? There we go. Alright, so under this little orange cube where it says object, at the very bottom of your list you're going to have ray visibility, and if that's already open, all you have to do is uncheck camera while selecting the second plane, and now it's invisible to the camera, but it still projects the light that we want. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and also change the color of my light to green and then darken it up a bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and actually look through my camera's view. I'm pressing 0 and everything still looks okay. So let's go ahead and come back to the camera and select render. And now while it's rendering, aside from just visually seeing how far along it is, if you look up here at the top, you have this little progress bar. Okay, and as you can see, the dark gray, as it's getting further along, naturally that just means that it's getting closer and closer to being done. Okay, so it's almost done, so we'll let it go ahead and finish up. And then afterwards we're going to go ahead and save this image, and at that point it's going to be the end of the tutorial. And so in the third and final tutorial for this Introduction to Blender series, I'm going to show you how to take these objects, deform them, and show you how to actually manipulate them to make something that you actually want. Okay. Alright, so now that our scene is done, we're going to go ahead and go down to Image, Save As, and I want to save this on the desktop for this, and I actually did this previously, So I'm just going to go ahead and rename it to the Blender Training Series Render, which you rename your objects here, or not your objects, but your images here, and then you can just go up and hit Save As. And then if you want to save your project, it's as simple as going to File, Save, and then giving it a name, just like in that last window, and hitting Save, and you're done. Okay, so again, in the next tutorial, we're going to manipulate these objects, turn them into something we want, and actually make anything that we can. And that'll give you the basics of modeling that we're going to use in my second series that I'm going to start afterwards on how to make video games from beginning to end, and dropping the models that you create in Blender into a third-party rendering engine that is actually free, so you don't have to spend any money, and we're going to learn how to make a video game. So until then, thank you for watching, please subscribe, and I will see you next time.